Welcome to the third video in this series on melody. In our last video, we discussed motivic development. We covered a large number of powerful techniques and strategies that can be used to transform and develop a motivic statement, as well as briefly touched on how different degrees of variation are typically applied within a piece of music. In this video, we're going to tackle the next step in writing melodies by discussing phrase structures. We'll cover what phrases are, how they're built, and most importantly, how you can use them to turn your motivic ideas into full-on melodies. Before we get started, I want to take a quick moment to thank my amazing patrons, without whom I would not be able to make these videos. I appreciate each and every one of you. This week, I want to give a special shout out to my newest patrons, Michael, Abdal, Louis, and Nate. I'm glad to have you all on board as part of the Patreon community, and am looking forward to getting to know each of you better. If you're interested in becoming a patron, the link is in the description of this video. All proceeds go towards helping me make tuition payments for school. So with that, let's get started. First things first, what are musical phrases? Well, a phrase is the equivalent of a musical sentence. It's a full statement of a melodic idea, with both a beginning and an end. The primary difference between a motif and a musical phrase is that a phrase can stand on its own and sound complete by itself. Now, there are different kinds of phrases, and they can be separated into many different categories. However, the two specific categories we are going to focus on in this video are monomotivic versus polymotivic phrases, and question versus answer phrases. Let's start with that first group. All phrases consist of three basic components: beginning, development, and end. The job of the beginning section is to establish the motivic material that will be used during the rest of the phrase. The grand majority of phrases begin by introducing the initial statement of a motif, or the motivic variation, that will provide the source material for the rest of the phrase. Once the motivic material has been presented, we can move on to the development section, and this is where we start to see the difference between monomotivic and polymotivic phrases. Monomotivic means only one motif. So, a monomotivic phrase is one that contains only a single motivic idea. In these phrases, the development section does exactly what it sounds like. It develops the motif. And there are many different ways you can do this. You can sequence it, augment it, invert it, retrograde. Basically, you can use any of the strategies we discussed in the last video. However, the exact strategies you use and the degree to which you use them should not be random. They should be informed by the goal or the local peak that your phrase is building towards in the first place. The local peak is a brief moment that forms the identity or the purpose of an entire phrase. It's the moment of relatively high or low intensity that the entire phrase is centered around. Typically, the peak is planned ahead of time and closely related to the climax of the entire piece, but we'll save that discussion for the next video. For now, suffice to say that your peak is a culmination of a few different parameters in the music. It could be rhythm, pitch, harmony, you name it. For example, let's say that you are writing a melodic phrase with a peak that is focused around pitch. In this example, your peak will take the form of a single note performed at a higher pitch than anywhere else in the phrase. Keeping this in mind, every strategy you use to develop your motif should then be carefully selected to gradually build towards this peak. You could gradually sequence your motif higher and higher. You could gradually expand a particular interval with each variation. You name it. Your strategies don't even have to be linear. You could come closer to hitting that high note with a particular variation, only to fall further away with the next one. The point here is to use your creativity and musical knowledge to figure out how your original motivic idea will transform over the course of the phrase to reach that peak moment. Almost every phrase has a peak, and they don't all have to be a moment of high intensity. For example, a pitch-related peak could be focused on an overall lowest pitch instead of a highest. A peak focused on rhythm could build towards a moment of fastest rhythmic movement or slowest rhythmic movement. The only qualification for what makes a peak is that every other moment through the beginning and development sections of a phrase should build towards it. After reaching the peak during the development section, the phrase will typically switch to the ending section. Here it moves back away from the peak and ends in some form of musical punctuation, and we'll discuss more on this in just a bit. The main takeaway here is that a mono-motivic phrase will use its development section to develop the original motivic idea. However, polymotivic phrases do things a little differently. Polymotivic means many motifs, and, as the name suggests, it refers to phrases that contain more than one motivic idea. By far, the most common type are phrases with two motivic ideas, but it's not unheard of to use as many as three. In a polymotivic phrase, there's typically not enough time to fully develop both ideas. So, instead of building towards a local peak, the development section is spent introducing the second and/or third motivic statements. Then subsequent phrases can be used to develop these ideas, instead of trying to develop them within a single phrase. However, just like we saw earlier, polymotivic phrases will end with at least some form of musical punctuation. This is where our next category, question versus answer phrases, will come in. Now, chances are that you've heard of questions and answers in music many times before. It's a very common concept, but it's also something that many people struggle with when they first start out. The basic idea of this category is that question phrases sound incomplete on their own. They sound like the music should continue with another musical statement, just like a real-life conversation. If you were talking with a friend and you asked them a question, you would expect them to reply with an answer, or, at the very least, another question of their own. In comparison, answer phrases sound much more complete. They tend to feel like a place where you could potentially end the music. For example, here is a question phrase. Notice how it doesn't sound like it should end here. It would feel unsettling to end a piece like this. Here is an answer phrase. Now that feels much more final. Now, this idea can be helpful for identifying questions and answers when you're listening to music, but it's not as helpful for writing them yourself, and that is where musical punctuation comes in. There are 5 basic types of musical punctuation that can help determine if a phrase is a question or an answer: melodic, harmonic, rhythmic, textural, and dynamic. For example, let's look at melodic punctuation. At the end of a phrase, these are a few of the things that your melody can do to classify as an answer phrase. You can start to smooth out the contour, or in other words, you can use smaller intervals than you were using previously. You could also end in a pre-prepared register, meaning that you don't move it into any new octaves that haven't been used previously in that phrase. Or, perhaps most definitively, you can move down in pitch. This is actually very similar to what most English speakers are already used to. If I end a sentence moving up in pitch, does it sound like an answer? No, it sounds like a question. On the other hand, things sound much more final if I move down in pitch, like a proper answer. If we want to use our melodic punctuation like a question, all we have to do is the exact opposite of our answer traits. We can start using larger intervals, we can move to new octaves, and yes, we can end by moving up in pitch, The same goes for all the other types of punctuation. If we want to use them to clarify that a phrase is an answer, these are some common strategies we could use. If we wanted to mark it as a question, we could just do the opposite. Now, every single ending section of a phrase must contain a minimum of 2 parameters that agree that this is an answer. This is what makes it an ending. After all, the defining trait of an answer is that it sounds final. However, the more parameters that agree, the stronger the sense of finality your ending will have. The more parameters that disagree, the more your phrase will sound like a question. But that is something we will tackle in the next video. For now, just remember that to bring your phrase to a proper ending, the final section must contain at least 2 parameters that agree it should be coming to a close. So, let's wrap things up here with a brief summary before taking a look at a practical example in Cubase. All phrases contain 3 sections: a beginning, a development, and an end. Monomotivic phrases consist of only one motivic idea. Their beginning section introduces that material, while the development section applies variation to that idea to build towards a local peak. The ending section helps move back away from the peak while using at least 2 forms of punctuation to classify the phrase as an answer. Polymotivic phrases utilize 2 or 3 motivic ideas. Their beginning section introduces the first motivic idea, while their development section introduces the second and/or third. Like we saw with monomotivic phrases, the ending section brings the phrase to a close with at least 2 forms of punctuation, classifying the phrase as an answer. With that, let's take a look at the example.
All right, so here we have the same motif from last week. Let's give it a quick listen. All right, pretty simple. So first, let's get out a notepad and figure out a couple things. So since we're not doing a full piece, let's just look for the local peak. I'm going to say, let's go for pitch. All right, and then maybe volume, because I like to do at least 2. But 1 is perfectly fine too. So local peak, we'll go for a high note and the loudest note. All right, so then let's find a punctuation. Let's say that the melody and volume will, again, melody and volume will agree with us. So we've got our motif. We've got 4 bars that we're going to keep it in. Just a simple, short 4-bar phrase. Local peak of pitch and volume, and the punctuation, we're going to have melody and volume agreeing that it's coming to an end. So very simple. Let's try sequencing it. So I'll bring this up, bring that F down. Let's give this a listen. All right, so we also did a bit of interval expansion here. So sequenced it and brought this up. Now let's try. No, let's try. So we've got to keep that motif, 2 short eighth notes, and followed by quarter note. Let's come up to a C, because it looks like we're in the key of C. Let's give this a quick listen. Don't like coming back down there. So let's delete that. I got my keyboard working, so we go. I like that. We'll go just come back down. A, B, C. See how that sounds. So we've got it coming down, pre-prepared register, so that works for melody. We've got it moving downward, which also works for melody, but I would like to have a bit more stepwise motion. So I like that better. Let's give the whole thing a listen to. All right, I like that. So far, we've got most everything. We've got our main motif. We've repeated it with a little bit of sequencing and interval expansion. We kind of made a little bit of inversion here. Definitely switched some stuff around. This one, the deconstruction, is definitely the strongest variation. And we have our local pitch, our related peak, all right, coming all the way an octave higher than where we started. So this is the highest note, and it works right there. So here, basically from this peak, it starts to move back down, which is what we would like to see. Because remember, after the peak, we almost immediately enter the ending phrase, which is building towards using that punctuation. So we've got melodic punctuation going pretty well, because we're moving down. We're staying in a pre-prepared register without going to any new octaves. We stayed between C4 and C3. And the last step is by step. I mean, there's a bit of a leap here, but it's still step. So next, let's do some volume stuff. Oops. The simplest way to do this is, without playing it myself, I should just record it myself, is to just do a little bit of playing around with the velocity. You know what, let's just do this. So what velocity does, velocity is telling the piano how hard, or the computer how hard to hit the key of the piano. Most instruments, digital instruments, will have something designed so that it's got different dynamic volumes that it was recorded at. And this will help switch through that. So now we'll hear a little bit of the volume helping around. So it starts off soft, gets super loud on the peak, then comes back down. All right, let's give this whole thing a listen to. And there we go, a perfectly good 4-bar phrase written from a single idea.
And with that, we have reached the end of yet another video. I hope it was useful. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to this channel and share it with anyone else that you think might find it helpful. If you're interested in learning more about writing musical themes that tell a story, check out my new book, The Musical Storyteller, Translating Worlds, Characters, and Emotions into Music. The link is in the description of this video. I want to take a quick moment to thank my amazing patrons once more for their support of this channel. I appreciate each of you more than you know, and am incredibly grateful to have you on the team. I also want to thank all of you who show your support by watching these videos and sending me supportive comments, emails, and messages. Your enthusiasm keeps me excited and motivated to keep putting out these videos. So, as always, keep studying, keep working hard, and keep writing new music.